The 37-mile dash, racing death behind enemy lines Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945. Bad Orb, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Walter D. Fetterly stood at the tree line, field glasses pressed against his eye sockets so hard they left red circles on his skin. Through the magnified lens, Stalag IX-B spread across the hillside like a suppurating wound. Wooden barracks tilted at drunken angles, mud churned into black soup by thousands of boots, and wire. So much wire. The kind that caught the morning light and threw it back as 1,000 tiny warnings. Behind him, the diesel engines of 3 M4 Sherman tanks idled with a predator's patience. The M36 tank destroyers, those angular beasts mounting 90mm guns that could punch through anything the Germans had left, sat hull down in defilade positions, their long barrels pointed toward Bad Orb like accusing fingers. Fetterly lowered the glasses. His hands, he noticed, were not shaking. That was good. He would need steady hands for what came next. 37 miles. They had driven 37 miles through German-held territory to reach this moment. Not around the enemy. Not beside them. Through them. Like a knife through rotten meat. The mission briefing 3 days earlier had been clinical. Steadily. Numbers on a map, coordinates, radio frequencies. But the words underneath the tactical language carried a different weight. 6,000 Allied prisoners. Critical status. Death march imminent. The Red Cross reports that had reached Washington painted Stalag IX-B not as a prisoner of war camp, but as something else. Something that existed in the grey space between military detention and the horror everyone now knew was happening in the camps with different names. The camps with smokestacks. Now, Easter Sunday, how grimly appropriate, Fetterly had to decide whether to order his tanks to charge a fortified position or to walk down that hill alone with a white flag. The German commandant, Oberst Karl Sieber, was still inside the camp. So were his guards. So were their weapons. Behind Fetterly, a young radio man shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Sir," he said, voice tight as wire, "the Krauts in the town, they're—" "I know," Fetterly said. "They were watching. German soldiers, remnants of units crushed by the Allied advance, holdouts who hadn't gotten the memo that this war was over, or who had gotten it and decided to make the Americans pay for every goddamn meter anyway. Bad Orb, a spa town of 7,000 civilians that had once offered healing thermal waters to the sick, now bristled with the weapons of the cornered. Machine gun nests, Panzerfausts. Maybe. Intelligence was never certain about these things. Some of those new assault guns, Sturmgeschütze, with their low profiles and big guns. The arithmetic was simple and cruel. Fetterly commanded approximately 800 men of the 2nd Battalion, 114th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by Company C of the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion and elements of the 106th Cavalry Group. Against them, an unknown number of German defenders who could either surrender or fight. And in the middle, on that hill, 6,000 Allied prisoners too weak to run if the shooting started. Fetterly had graduated from Pennsylvania Military College in 1929. 16 years of peacetime soldiering, then this. He thought about his wife Clara, about his 3 sons back in New Brunswick. He thought about the letter in his pocket from Division Command, written in the careful language that generals use when they order you to do something that might kill everyone under your command. Mission critical. Exercise all possible speed. Avoid unnecessary casualties. Unnecessary. As if any of them were necessary. The hellhole. Private First Class John Moddy lay on the floor of Barracks 35. There were no bunks anymore, not really, just wooden platforms crawling with lice so thick they moved like a living carpet. And tried to remember what 150 pounds had felt like on his frame. He weighed 85 pounds now. Maybe less. The hunger had moved past pain into something else. A kind of hollow ringing that filled his chest cavity and made everything feel both heavy and weightless at once. Christmas Eve, 1944. That's when he'd arrived at Stalag IX-B after being captured during the Battle of the Bulge. 4 months ago. Might as well have been 4 years. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last desperate gamble, throwing everything at the American lines in the Ardennes forest. And for a few days, it had worked. The 106th Infantry Division, green troops mostly, had been surrounded, cut off, forced to surrender in numbers that made the history books wince. Moddy's unit, the 590th Field Artillery Battalion, had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. The march from Belgium to Germany had taken 4 days. 4 days in December, cold with food and water distributed once. Once, men had collapsed in the snow and been shot where they lay, or left to freeze, which was the same thing with different timing. At Gerolstein, they'd been packed into boxcars, 60 men per car. Cars so small you couldn't lie down, couldn't even sit properly, just stood or crouched, human sardines in a rolling can. They'd entered those cars on December 21st and didn't exit until December 26th. 5 days, fed once during the entire journey. Some men had tried to escape during that journey. 8 of them had jumped from the train into a field. Then the landmine, 1 mine, 8 bodies, parts of bodies, not bodies anymore, but puzzle pieces scattered across frozen ground. The German sergeant in charge, enraged by the escape attempt, or maybe just enraged by the whole collapsing architecture of the Reich, had started firing his rifle into the boxcars at random. Just shooting. The screaming had lasted for hours after he stopped. Stalag IX-B was supposed to be a transit camp, a place where prisoners were classified and then sent to appropriate facilities. Officers here, enlisted men there, everybody sorted like mail. But the sorting had stopped. The system, like everything else in Germany by early 1945, had broken down completely. So they stayed. And stayed. And the camp swelled with more prisoners from the Bulge until it held 3 times its capacity. Marty had been assigned to a barracks with bunks stacked 5 high. The first night, he'd tried to sleep in one. The lice, ancient and established, covered every inch of the straw mattresses. You could hear them moving if you held still enough. A sound like rain on leaves. So most men had abandoned the bunks and slept on the floor, sardine-packed again, trying not to step on each other when they had to piss in the night. The German food rations had a paper value of 1/400 calories. Paper value. Reality was different. Breakfast. A cup of something they called coffee, but which tasted like burnt acorns and chemical runoff. Lunch. Thin soup, usually made from turnips or potatoes or whatever root vegetables could be scrounged, occasionally graced with something that might have once been meat. Dinner. A small piece of bread, sometimes with margarine, sometimes not. The bread itself was a marvel of German efficiency. Sawdust, chestnuts, and perhaps 30% actual grain, baked into a substance that required strong teeth and a stronger stomach. Allied bombing of German transportation networks had turned the country's logistics into a bad joke. The Red Cross parcels that were supposed to reach the camp, each one containing condensed milk, chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, the stuff that kept POWs alive, sat in warehouses or train cars blown apart by American B-17s. The Germans themselves were starving now. Their cities were rubble. Their armies were retreating on every front. But somehow, perversely, they still kept the camps running, still counted prisoners at morning appel, still shot you if you crossed the warning wire. 1 Red Cross shipment had made it through. 1. On March 10th, 2,300 parcels for 6,000 men. They'd rationed them carefully, stretching each parcel across multiple prisoners, making the chocolate last by breaking it into pieces so small they dissolved on your tongue before you could properly taste them. Between February 28th and April 1st, 32 Americans had died in Stalag IX-B. The causes read like a menu of institutional failure: malnutrition, pneumonia, dysentery, typhus. There were 2 American medical officers in the camp and 10 medical orderlies. They did what they could. It was not enough. On March 23rd, the camp infirmary held 72 patients. 22 had pneumonia. The others suffered from the kaleidoscopic effects of starvation. Your body, deprived of what it needs, begins to consume itself, and strange things happen. Hemorrhagic fever. Edema. Your gums bleed. Your teeth loosen. You bruise at the slightest touch. Old fractures that had healed years ago suddenly ache again as your body leaches calcium from your bones to keep your heart beating. And the disease. God, the disease. Dysentery turned the latrines into a horror show of blood and mucus and desperate men who couldn't control their bodies anymore. Typhus, spread by the lice that everyone hosted, caused fever so high men became delirious, shouting at people who weren't there, fighting invisible enemies. Influenza and bronchitis moved through the cramped barracks like smoke. And in winter in central Germany, where temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there, every cough was a potential death sentence. But the worst thing, Modi thought, wasn't the hunger or the disease or even the lice. The worst thing was the not knowing. They'd heard rumors about the camps, the other camps, the ones where people went in trains and didn't come out. You could see the smoke from some of them at night, dark columns against darker sky. Jewish prisoners told stories about what happened to Jews. Stories so extreme they sounded like propaganda, except the teller's eyes said otherwise. In January, something had happened that confirmed the rumors weren't just rumors. The camp commandant had ordered all Jewish prisoners to step forward during morning assembly. Just step forward. Simple enough. Except everyone knew that stepping forward meant something bad. Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds, the senior American NCO in the camp, had given a different order. Everyone stands together. We are all Jews here, he'd told the German commandant. For several hours, 4,000 men stood in the cold while the Germans decided whether to shoot the lot of them or back down. Eventually, under various pressures, threats, beatings, exhaustion, 130 men had identified themselves as Jewish. But the Germans had wanted 350 for their special transport, so they'd selected more. Men with Jewish-sounding names, men who looked Jewish according to some demented physiognomic calculus, and troublemakers. Private First Class Hans Kasten, elected camp leader, went on the transport. He was German-American, born in Hawaii of German immigrant parents, spoke both languages fluently. The Germans hated him for his insolence, his refusal to bow. On February 8th, those 350 men had been loaded onto trains. Destination, Berge an der Elster, a name that meant nothing then. A name that would mean everything later. The Americans left behind had heard fragments. Berge was a work camp. The men there were digging tunnels for underground factories. Ammunition plants. The work was brutal. The conditions made Stalag IX-B look like a resort. Some of the men sent to Berge had already died. How many? Nobody knew. The Germans weren't saying, and the prisoners who might have known weren't coming back. Now, April 1st, Modi lay on the floor and listened. The guard posts had been quiet for hours. Too quiet. The Germans were either gone or waiting. Through the barracks wall, thin as paper, he could hear other men breathing. Some prayed. Some cried quietly, thinking nobody could hear. Some just breathed, which was itself a kind of prayer. Then, faint, distant but unmistakable, the sound of engines. Not German engines with their high whine. American engines. Diesel. Lots of them. Modi sat up too fast and the barracks spun. Someone grabbed his shoulder. You hear that? The man whispered. Yeah, Modi said. I hear it. Hope, he thought, was a dangerous thing. The drive April 3rd, 1945. 0600 hours. Task Force Fetterly crossed the German front lines at a point where front line was more theoretical than actual. The Wehrmacht, once a juggernaut that had conquered most of Europe, had been reduced to scattered units, old men and teenagers, all fighting with equipment that should have been in museums. But scattered and desperate still meant dangerous. Cornered animals bite. The task force composition read like a combined arms textbook. The 2nd Battalion of the 114th Infantry Regiment provided the ground troops, infantry who could dismount and fight building to building if necessary. The M4 Sherman tanks, workhorse of the American Armored Force, reliable if not spectacular, capable of taking punishment and dealing it back, gave mobile firepower. The M36 tank destroyers mounted 90mm guns that could kill anything the Germans fielded at ranges that made tank commanders nervous. And elements of the 106th Cavalry Group, equipped with light tanks and armoured cars, provided reconnaissance and flank security. Total strength, roughly 800 men, 16 tanks, 28 half-tracks and assorted support vehicles. Not a huge force. But fast, mobile, and packing enough punch to blast through opposition rather than around it. The plan was simple because all good plans are: punch through the German line, drive like hell, avoid engagements when possible, destroy anything that couldn't be avoided, reach Bad Orb, secure the camp. Speed was everything. Intelligence, always a polite term for educated guessing, suggested the Germans might evacuate Stalag IX-B ahead of the American advance. Evacuate, in this context, meant death march. Thousands of starving, sick prisoners forced to walk until they dropped. Then you shot the ones who dropped and kept walking with the survivors. Rinse, repeat, until liberation or death, whichever came first. The 44th Infantry Division, parent unit of Fetterly's battalion, had been fighting continuously since landing in France in September 1944. Alsace-Lorraine, the Vosges Mountains, the Rhine crossing. Every battle had ground down the division's strength and sharpened its edge simultaneously. They were good at this now, good at the grim arithmetic of industrial warfare where victory meant you killed more of them than they killed of you, and you kept killing until they stopped being a cohesive fighting force. The breakthrough happened faster than expected. German positions along the supposed front line were either unmanned or lightly held. The defenders who were present fought briefly, then melted away, either surrendering or running. Smart ones ran. The first 10 miles disappeared under the tracks of the Shermans in less than an hour. Then the opposition stiffened. A roadblock. German infantry with Panzerfausts, those single-shot anti-tank weapons that could kill a Sherman if they hit the right spot. The lead tank's commander spotted them, traversed his turret, and fired. The 75-meter gun's report was flat and brutal. The roadblock disappeared in smoke and fragmentation. The column kept moving. Mile 15, a small village, name unimportant, where someone had decided to make a stand. Machine gun fire from second-story windows. The infantry dismounted, took cover, returned fire. The tanks moved up, their presence alone often enough to break resistance. But not this time. Stubborn bastards. One of the M36s put a 90mm round through the building's first floor. The machine gun fire stopped. The column kept moving. The cavalry elements ranged ahead, their light tanks and armored cars probing roads and intersections, radioing back positions of German units. Most of those units, informed that American armor was approaching, decided discretion was the better part of valor and withdrew. A few didn't. Those few learned about 90mm guns. Mile 25. They crossed a small river, bridge intact somehow. Small miracle given that the Germans had been demolishing infrastructure to slow the Allied advance. Perhaps the local commander had fled before giving the order. Perhaps the demolition team had decided the war was over and gone home. Either way, intact bridge, column across, no time wasted. Mile 30. Bad Orb appeared on the horizon, nestled in its valley. Recon elements radioed back. German presence in town, strength unknown, at least one assault gun spotted, possibly more. Fetterly made the calculation every commander makes: bypass or assault. Bypassing meant leaving an enemy force on your supply line. Assaulting meant casualties and delay. But the camp was on the hill above the town. To reach the camp, you had to go through the town or around it, and around meant time they didn't have. Through it was... The assault on Bad Orb began with artillery. The 44th Division Artillery, positioned miles to the south, had displaced forward to provide fire support. Now their guns spoke, lobbing high explosive shells into the town. The German assault guns and infantry who'd decided to defend Bad Orb found themselves fighting not just the approaching task force, but artillery that could drop shells on their positions with hideous accuracy. The Shermans and tank destroyers advanced in a textbook combined arms assault, infantry following behind the armor, everyone covering everyone else. German machine gun positions that engaged got marked and destroyed. The assault gun, a Sturmgeschütz III, low and lethal, got off one shot that missed before an M36 put a 90mm round through its frontal armor. The vehicle exploded, ammunition cooking off, turret flying into the air like a toy. The fighting in Bad Orb lasted 3 hours. House to house in some sectors, block to block in others. The German defenders fought well, considering. But considering doesn't stop tanks. By early afternoon, the town was secured, German prisoners were being rounded up, and Fetterly was looking up that hill at the camp. Through his field glasses, movement behind the wire. Prisoners watching. Guards watching the prisoners watching. The gates were still closed. The commandant hadn't surrendered yet. Hadn't run yet either, which was interesting. Maybe he was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Maybe he still thought he could negotiate. Fetterly called his company commanders together. Brief, to the point. 3 tanks would charge the hill, smash through the main gate, secure the compound. Infantry would follow to mop up any resistance. Tank destroyers would provide overwatch in case something nasty appeared from an unexpected direction. Medical personnel would move up immediately to begin triage. Any questions? Fetterly asked. Nobody had questions. They'd come 37 miles for this. Time to finish it. The Gate Private First Class JCF. Hans Kasten wasn't at Stalag IX-B to witness the liberation. He was at Berga an der Elster, or rather, on the roads leading away from Berga, on what the Germans euphemistically called an evacuation, but which everyone else called a death march. The tunnels at Berga, 17 of them driven into mountainsides by slave labour, were supposed to house an underground synthetic fuel factory. Brown coal into aviation gasoline through the magic of German engineering. Except the engineering required labour, and the only labour available now were prisoners. Jews from Buchenwald concentration camp and 350 American POWs that the Germans had decided were either Jewish, looked Jewish, had Jewish-sounding names, or were troublemakers who needed extra persuading about the virtues of the Reich. Kasten was a troublemaker. Born in Hawaii of German parents, fluent in both languages, he'd been elected man of confidence by his fellow prisoners at Stalag IX-B, the liaison between prisoners and German administration. When Oberst Sieber had ordered Jewish prisoners to step forward, Kasten had been among those who'd publicly defied the order. For that, he'd been beaten, then selected for the Berga transport. The work at Berga was murder disguised as labour. 12-hour shifts in the tunnels, digging with hand tools, breathing rock dust that turned your lungs into sandpaper, eating rations that made Stalag IX-B's food look generous. Men died regularly, some from beatings, some from disease, some just stopped, lay down and didn't get up again. The Germans logged these deaths with bureaucratic precision. Cardiac arrest, pneumonia, natural causes. Never mind that natural causes in a labour camp meant worked to death. On April 7th, as American forces closed in, the Germans had emptied Berga. Forced march, all prisoners who could still walk. Those who couldn't walk weren't coming. The march covered 217 miles over 2 weeks, sleeping on roadsides, no shelter, minimal food, guards shooting anyone who couldn't keep up. Kasten watched men die every day. He kept a mental list of the dead because someone had to remember. Someone had to bear witness. During an air raid, when the guards had extinguished the camp lights and confusion reigned, Kasten and 2 others, Joe Little and Ernst Sinner, had escaped. Slipped under the wire and ran. Freedom lasted 3 days. They'd tried to get food at a village inn and been arrested. Gestapo headquarters. Identification as POWs, which saved their lives because shooting escaped POWs meant Geneva Convention violations, and even the Gestapo sometimes worried about post-war accountability. Buchenwald concentration camp instead. Detention cells. They would have died there probably, except Buchenwald was liberated on April 11th by the US. Army's 6th Armored Division. Of the 350 Americans sent to Berga, 86 died before liberation. 70 of those deaths occurred during the evacuation march, bodies left on roadsides across eastern Germany, markers of the Reich's terminal collapse. The survivors weighed on average 90 pounds. Many had tuberculosis. Most had psychological damage that would take decades to surface, if it surfaced at all. The US government, embarrassed by this story, embarrassed that American POWs had been subjected to concentration camp conditions, embarrassed by the implications of Jews being selected for special punishment, embarrassed by everything about it, classified the whole thing. The survivors were forced to sign secrecy agreements. Don't talk about Berga. Don't talk about what happened. Don't embarrass the army. Some of the men wouldn't talk about it for 50 years. Some never talked about it at all, carried it inside like shrapnel, sharp and hidden. But that came later. On April 2nd, 1945, Kasten was walking. Somewhere in eastern Germany, exact location uncertain, walking with men who looked like skeletons wrapped in dirty uniforms, walking because stopping meant dying. And at Stalag IX-B, where he should have been, tanks were smashing through the main gate. Liberation. The 3 Shermans charged up the hill in a wedge formation, engines roaring, treads chewing earth, main guns elevated to engage anything that appeared threatening. Behind them, infantrymen ran in tactical bounds, covering each other, expecting resistance that never materialized. The main gate, pipe frame wrapped in barbed wire, the kind of barrier that stops people but not tanks, folded inward under the impact of the lead Sherman like tissue paper. The tank rolled into the compound, turret traversing left and right, commander's head visible in the open hatch, looking for targets. The German guards, those who hadn't already fled, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Some called out in English, "Don't shoot." "We surrender." Their uniforms were Wehrmacht, not SS, which maybe mattered or maybe didn't. They were just old men and boys, the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, Germany's last desperate scraping of manpower. Oberst Karl Sieber, commandant of Stalag IX-B, emerged from his office accompanied by two subordinates. He was carrying a white flag. Actually carrying one. Where does one even get a white flag at short notice? Had he kept it ready, anticipating this moment? The symbolism was perfect and pathetic. The formal surrender of a camp that had ceased to function as anything except a warehouse for dying men. Lieutenant Colonel Fetterly arrived minutes later in a jeep. He dismounted, regarded Sieber with the expression of a man looking at something distasteful he'd found on his boot, and accepted the surrender. The exchange was brief. Sieber spoke German, Fetterly spoke English, someone translated, paperwork was signed. The camp, officially, was now under American control. Then Fetterly turned to look at what he'd liberated. The prisoners emerged from barracks and tents like ghosts, hesitant, unbelieving. Some cried. Some laughed. Some just stood and stared at the tanks as if unsure they were real. These men, they'd been soldiers, infantry, artillery, support troops. Young men in good physical condition who'd gone into combat weighing 150, 170, 200 pounds. Now they were scarecrows, all angles and hollow eyes, uniforms hanging off frames that had lost a third of their body weight. The smell hit Fetterly like a physical blow, human waste, rot, disease, death. The barracks stank. The whole camp stank. Latrines that hadn't been properly maintained. Bodies of men who'd died and not been buried yet. The sick and dying still inside the infirmary, lying on wooden platforms, no mattresses, no blankets, just waiting. American medics moved through the camp triaging. Green tags for the walking wounded, those who could be evacuated immediately. Yellow tags for the sick, those who needed medical care but weren't critical. Red tags for the dying. Black tags for the dead. The tags multiplied. Yellow, yellow, red, yellow, black, red, yellow. The 70th Infantry Division, positioned nearby, heard about the liberation and emptied their post-exchange stores. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned goods. Everything went into trucks and up to the camp. The men who'd been starving for months suddenly had food. Real food. And then they learned the hard way that you can't feed a starving man a full meal. Their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle it. Men who'd dreamed about chocolate for 4 months vomited it back up. The medics had to carefully ration the food, small amounts at frequent intervals, letting digestive systems slowly remember how to process nutrition. Coffee was passed out, real American coffee. The instant swill from sea rations, but to men who'd been drinking ersatz coffee made from burnt acorns and God knew what else, it tasted like heaven. Donuts appeared from somewhere. Where does one get donuts on a battlefield? But there they were, and prisoners ate them slowly, reverently, making them last. The evacuation began immediately. The sickest prisoners first, loaded onto trucks and driven to field hospitals. Then the walking wounded. Then everyone else. 10 days to evacuate 6,000 men. 10 days of processing, paperwork, medical examinations, feeding, clothing, transportation to rear areas where they could be properly treated. Some prisoners couldn't leave immediately. Too sick, too weak. They stayed in the camp under American medical care, gaining strength, adding weight, slowly recovering. Marty was one of these. His weight had dropped to 85 pounds from 150. The doctors wanted him at 100 before they'd let him travel. So he stayed, ate small meals 6 times a day, slept on a cot with actual blankets, and slowly, incrementally, returned from the edge. Camp Lucky Strike, near Le Havre, France, became the main processing center for liberated POWs from Germany. Thousands of men flowed through Lucky Strike's tents and mess halls, being deloused, examined, debriefed, fed, prepared for return to the United States. The army wanted to know everything. What did you see? What were conditions like? What were German capabilities? Were there war crimes? The prisoners answered questions, gave statements, tried to explain the inexplicable. Some men, the worst cases, went directly to hospitals. Stateside hospitals with real doctors and real equipment and staff who hadn't been working in tents under fire. They stayed there for months, recovering physically, and beginning the much longer process of recovering mentally. The physical wounds healed, mostly. Vitamin deficiencies corrected. Infections cleared up. Weight returned. But the other wounds, the ones you couldn't see on X-rays, those took longer. Decades longer. Some never healed. Aftermath. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the war in Europe officially ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had made it 12. In the final accounting, the Third Reich had murdered approximately 11 million people in concentration camps and extermination centers, 6 million of them Jews. The Americans found the camps. The British found the camps. The Russians found the camps. And the world, watching newsreel footage of bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves at Bergen-Belsen, of skeleton prisoners staring through barbed wire at Buchenwald, of gas chambers at Auschwitz, struggled to process the industrial scale of the killing. American POWs, according to the Geneva Convention, were supposed to be protected. Military prisoners, not civilian victims. The Wehrmacht was supposed to follow rules. There were supposed to be inspections, Red Cross visits, minimum standards of treatment. And for most American POWs in German hands, those rules were largely followed. Stalags held British and American prisoners under conditions that, while certainly not pleasant, weren't death camps. Food was inadequate but present. Medical care was minimal but available. You could survive German captivity if you weren't Jewish and weren't in one of the bad camps. But Stalag IX-B was a bad camp. Overcrowded, undersupplied, overwhelmed by the collapse of German logistics, it had degenerated into something approaching a death camp in everything but name. The 32 Americans who died there between late February and early April died from causes: malnutrition, disease, neglect, that should never have killed POWs in a properly administered camp. And Berger was worse. Berger was a concentration camp that happened to contain American POWs. The 350 men sent there were subjected to conditions that violated every provision of the Geneva Convention. They were worked as slave labor. They were beaten. They were starved. They died at rates comparable to concentration camp inmates. And then, when the story came out, the US government classified it and forced the survivors to stay silent. Why the silence? Multiple reasons, none good. First, embarrassment. Admitting that American soldiers had been subjected to Holocaust conditions meant admitting they hadn't been protected, which reflected poorly on the Army's intelligence and the government's diplomatic efforts. Second, prosecution issues. Several Berger guards and administrators were arrested for war crimes, and ongoing investigations required secrecy. Third, Cold War politics. By 1946, the Soviet Union was the new enemy, and dwelling on German atrocities when you needed Germany as a buffer state against communism was inconvenient. So the Berger survivors signed their secrecy agreements and went home and didn't talk about it. Some tried to forget. Some succeeded, more or less. Others couldn't. The nightmares stayed. The survivors' guilt, why did I live when they died, stayed. The physical damage to bodies that had been starved and worked to the breaking point stayed. Tuberculosis, heart damage, lung scarring from tunnel dust, all of it permanent. It took until the 1990s for the story to become widely known. Historians started asking questions. Survivors, now in their 70s and 80s, started talking despite the secrecy agreements because what were they going to do? Prosecute an 80-year-old veteran? Books appeared. Documentaries. The US? Holocaust Memorial Museum added Berger to its exhibits. Slowly, the classification lifted. The story entered the historical record where it belonged. Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds, who'd told the German commandant, "We are all Jews here," and saved unknown numbers of lives by refusing to let them be separated and deported to Berger, was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in 2015, the first American serviceman to receive that honor. His actions in January 1945 had been known to his fellow prisoners but not widely publicized. Now they were part of history, an example of moral courage when courage meant risking your own life to protect others. Lieutenant Colonel Walter D. Fetterly returned to the United States after the war, resumed his life in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and continued serving in the National Guard. In 1950, when an ammunition depot exploded in South Amboy, killing 31 and injuring 300, Fetterly commanded the National Guard units that maintained order during the emergency. He worked as president of a textile company, served on various civic boards, stayed active in veterans organizations. He died in January 1987 at age 80, in his winter home in Florida. His obituaries mentioned his Bronze Star, his community service, his business career. The liberation of Stalag IX-B was noted, but not emphasized. It was just one event among many in a long life. But for the men he'd liberated, it was everything. They remembered the sound of those Sherman tanks coming up the hill. They remembered the gate falling. They remembered American soldiers, their countrymen, appearing in that compound like an answer to 4 months of prayer. Some of the survivors, decades later, would track down Fetterly and write him letters thanking him. He would write back politely saying he'd only done his duty, which was true but insufficient.